Stories of the past include disease outbreaks, which tormented humanity throughout history. How some reacted to them are inspirational, for others tragic. Disease outbreaks changed the story of humanity, affecting wars, international boundaries, lifestyles, and inevitably politics. Sickness ravaged armies and nations, small communities and large empires, and crossed oceans and seas. In North and South America, epidemics destroyed whole nations of Indian tribes. Disease outbreaks swept every corner of the globe, changing populations and civilizations, often destroying whole cultures. They entered humble abodes and great castles and estates, including the lives of famous people who suffered from historic disease outbreaks. Number 1. George Washington contracted smallpox as a youth. Smallpox outbreaks in Great Britain and Europe were common, almost annual affairs in the early 18th century. In America, outside the coastal cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, it remained relatively rare. Rural communities and distances between them prevented the disease from spreading through contagion. In Virginia, smallpox outbreaks did not occur before 1747, according to colonial records. In 1751, 19-year-old George Washington traveled to Barbados with his half-brother Lawrence, a trip made for the latter's health, as he battled what was known at the time as consumption tuberculosis. While in Barbados, George contracted smallpox, which left him deathly ill for over a month. Washington recovered, and the memory of his battle with the disease remained with him, the pockmarks on his face a daily reminder. He also carried knowledge of the disease's lethality and its highly contagious nature. 25 years later, his experience drove him to order the troops under his command inoculated against the disease, if they had not acquired natural immunity from an earlier attack. Washington thus became an innovator in protecting the health of his army from smallpox. He ordered the civilian camp followers attached to his troops to comply with the directive as well. Eventually, Washington commanded all new recruits be inoculated, which gave them a milder form of the disease for a shorter duration, while they were being trained and equipped. Number 2. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Spanish flu. In his role as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt traveled to Europe in 1918. His mission included inspections of naval and port facilities and coordination with officials of the British, French, and Italian navies. He departed Europe for America aboard USS Leviathan, a converted ocean liner serving as a troopship. In September, the ship had delivered members of the American Expeditionary Force to France. On the return voyage, influenza, which appeared in the United States earlier in the summer, broke out in the ship, killing several of the crew during the 11-day voyage. FDR contracted influenza during the voyage. FDR's fabled luck held, and he recovered from the worst of the disease. Before Leviathan arrived in the United States, he remained weak and relatively frail for several weeks following his bout with the flu, which killed upwards of 50 million, some say 100 million, people around the world from 1918 to 1920. The attack of the flu led Roosevelt to adopt the ideas of the temperance movement, and he supported prohibition during the presidential campaign of 1920. Ironically, after his bout with another disease of gigantic proportion, polio, FDR became a fervent anti-prohibitionist, running on a campaign which supported repeal of the 18th Amendment and ending prohibition at the law of the land in 1932. Number 3. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and polio. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, outbreaks of polio grew into frightening numbers in the United States and Europe. Caused by a virus, polio became a feared disease when outbreaks in crowded areas of cities reached biblical proportions. Often in the summer months, caused by contact with water contaminated by fecal matter, it became a serious health problem as America's waters became dumping grounds for raw sewage. In 1921, Franklin Delano Roosevelt vacationed in Campobello. While there, he developed symptoms consistent with polio, including high fever and paralysis which moved slowly up his legs. The doctors diagnosed him with polio, and he remained paralyzed from his waist down for the rest of his life, relegated to a wheelchair. More recently, doctors diagnosed Franklin Delano Roosevelt with Guillain-Barré syndrome, rather than polio, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't know that. His doctors never considered such a diagnosis. For the rest of his life he battled polio, both personally by swimming and taking the waters at Warm Springs, Georgia, and from his eventual office in the White House. It was FDR who founded in 1938 the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, known colloquially as the March of Dimes. The name March of Dimes, suggested by entertainer Eddie Cantor, referred to a national fundraising campaign, sending dimes to the White House. Eventually, $85,000 was raised in the first of many such campaigns. The March of Dimes funded the work of Jonas Salk, and by the end of the 20th century, the feared disease of polio was all but erased from the list of the world's woes. Number 4. James Knox Polk and cholera. James Knox Polk was 54 when he left the White House, after serving just one term as president in 1849. One term had been his choice, announced when he ran for the office 4 years earlier. His single term proved to be momentous, including the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, and the peaceful resolution of the Oregon border dispute with Great Britain. Polk's presidency exhibited the idea of manifest destiny more than any other American administration. When it was over, the former president planned to return to his recently acquired home in Nashville, following a tour of his native South. His tour, which began in the March of 1849, coincided with outbreaks of cholera in the southern states. Polk caught a cold early in the tour, which worsened as he crossed Alabama on his way to New Orleans. Polk heard of the cholera which heavily affected Louisiana, but went to New Orleans anyway, from whence he journeyed by riverboat up the Mississippi. While in New Orleans or on the riverboat, on which several passengers died, Polk contracted cholera. He reached Nashville on April 2nd, briefly recovered his strength but became ill again in June. Polk died of cholera in Nashville on June 15, 1849, just 3 months after leaving the presidency. Number 5. George Herman Ruth and the Spanish flu. During the late summer of 1918, Major League Baseball curtailed its season, which ended a month early during the mobilization for World War I. The season ended on September 2nd, with the Boston Red Sox and the Chicago Cubs scheduled to meet in the only World Series in history played entirely during the month of September. Spanish flu had already established a grip on the city of Boston, and several doctors warned against drawing large crowds to Fenway Park. Concerned over the spread of the abnormally lethal flu, baseball decided to go ahead with the series, during which the Red Sox young pitcher George Herman Ruth, known to his fans as Babe, started 2 games. He won both. Babe Ruth suffered through the Spanish flu before and during the World Series. He lost the advantage of using the spitball, a popular pitch of the era, because baseball temporarily banned it as a health measure to fight outbreaks. Many reports claimed that Babe contracted the flu, recovered, and then contracted it again, a claim which belied the immunity left to those who recovered. Ruth started games 1 and 4, pitched a shutout in the first game, and 7 consecutive scoreless innings in the second before giving up a run. In between innings, he would often lie down, as the aches and fever of the flu tormented him. He played in other games in the outfield. Following the World Series, the Babe accepted a job in a vital war industry, earning an exemption from military services. Number 6. The Wright Brothers and Typhoid fever. Numerous outbreaks of typhoid fever occurred across the United States in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and it still occurs with some frequency in the 21st. Poor hygiene is the primary cause of its spread, and it, like all outbreaks and contagions, thrives in crowded areas. In 1912, Wilbur Wright traveled to Boston, Massachusetts, on a business trip for the company founded by his brother and him, the Wright Company. While there he became ill, which he originally blamed on the consumption of a bad oyster. Wilbur remained in Boston until early May, at which time he felt well enough for the train trip back to Dayton, Ohio, where both brothers lived. Once in Dayton, he again became ill, and his doctor diagnosed typhoid fever. Wilbur died on May 30, 1912. Following his death, his younger brother Orville took over as president of the Wright Company, but Orville lacked the business acumen and physical stamina for the job. In 1915, Orville sold the company. In 1918, Orville made his last flight as a pilot, after which he retired from business and served as a consultant, and with various committees and boards serving the growth of aviation. Wilbur's encounter with typhoid fever ended the successful partnership between the brothers who gave the world the first practical airplane. Number 7. Abraham Lincoln and smallpox. During the American Civil War, a smallpox outbreak occurred in Washington, D.C. Lincoln had never been inoculated for the disease, and the president came down with smallpox during the late fall. Some have speculated the president contracted the disease on the train to Pennsylvania to deliver the Gettysburg Address. However, Lincoln's son Ted already had smallpox, preventing Mary Todd Lincoln from traveling to Pennsylvania with her husband. Lincoln's smallpox, long treated as a relatively minor case, was in recent years identified as severe and debilitating for some time. During the late fall and early winter of 1863 to 1864, Lincoln was unable to meet with several advisors due to the risk of exposure. During the period of the disease in which the president remained bedridden, his personal valet, William Henry Johnson, served as his primary care provider. Lincoln remained on bed rest for 3 weeks, before returning to light duties with limited visitors after Christmas. By mid-January, Johnson contracted the disease, Dying of smallpox in a local hospital on January 28, 1864, Lincoln arranged and paid for the loyal valet's funeral, and has co-signed a loan for his late valet. Lincoln arranged with the lender to pay half of the balance. The lender forgave the rest of the debt. Johnson was buried at Arlington Cemetery, one of 3,000 African Americans buried there during the Civil War, as citizens rather than soldiers. Number 8. Mary Mallon and typhoid fever. Born in Ireland in 1869, Mary Mallon moved to the United States in the early 1880s, where she lived with relatives in New York and found work as a cook for affluent families. In 1900, she worked and resided in Mamaroneck briefly. Several residents developed typhoid fever during her brief residence there. In 1901, she relocated to Manhattan as a live-in servant. Several members of the family developed typhoid fever, and another servant died from the illness. She took a position with another family in Manhattan, a household of 8. Of the 8, 7 became ill again with typhoid. Mary then moved to Oyster Bay. With a family of 11, 10 became ill with typhoid fever. The pattern continued through several households where she worked. In 1907, a researcher identified Mary as the source of the typhoid outbreaks, and officials quarantined her until 1910. Mary became known as Typhoid Mary, the first asymptomatic carrier of Salmonella typhi identified in the United States. Released from quarantine in 1910, she worked for a time as a laundress before changing her name to Mary Brown and returning to work as a cook. In 1915, another outbreak of typhoid fever in New York was traced to her. Authorities again arrested and confined her, and she remained in quarantine for the rest of her life, dying in 1938 from complications caused by a stroke. At least 51 typhoid infections were attributed to direct contact with her, and at least 3 deaths. Some experts set the total infections and deaths she caused in the hundreds. Number 9. Walt Disney and Spanish flu. September 1918, an adventurous 17-year-old Walt Disney expressed his desire to join the American forces heading to Europe. Accompanied by a friend who had been rejected for service in the U.S. Navy, Disney enrolled in the Red Cross Ambulance Corps, hoping to be deployed to France. Sent to a training center in Chicago, Disney contracted the Spanish flu then raging across America. At the time, Disney's parents resided in Chicago, and the young man returned to his family's home to recuperate. Ill for several weeks, he recovered, and after regaining his strength he resumed his training with the Ambulance Corps. In November, following the armistice which ended the fighting in Europe, Disney finally shipped overseas. The ambulance service still had work to do, but for the most part, Disney was bored with the lack of activity. To alleviate the ennui, he began to decorate the sides of ambulances with cartoons. His creativity drew the attention of editors at Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, and some of his cartoons and characters appeared in the paper in early 1919. In autumn of that year, Disney returned to the United States, settling first in Kansas City, Missouri, where his career as an animator began in earnest. Number 10. Edvard Munch and Spanish flu. Norwegian artist Edvard Munch is perhaps best known for his 1893 painting he titled Der Schrei der Natur, The Scream of Nature, popularly referred to simply as The Scream. 4 known versions of the painting exist, one of which bears the inscription, "Can only have been painted by a madman." Placed there by Munch, the painter survived a grim childhood and spent most of his life dealing with emotional stress and the fear of mental illness which ran through his family. He drank heavily in his early life, reflected in his work, though in 1908 a mental and physical breakdown forced him to give up alcohol, at least in public. Munch practiced what he called soul painting, transferring to canvas or other medium his feelings as a form of self-therapy. He strove to capture the suffering of people in his work, and his paintings included those of children ill with tuberculosis and the anguish of their parent caretaker. In 1918, after a lifetime of poor health, Munch contracted Spanish flu. He chose to paint a self-portrait which he titled Self-Portrait with the Spanish Flu. It depicted him sitting in isolation, alone in a room with an unmade bed in the background, a haggard, suffering expression on his face. It became symbolic of the illness. Munch, to his own surprise, survived the flu outbreaks and continued to work producing copies of his paintings until his death in 1944 in Nazi-occupied Norway. Number 11. Queen Elizabeth I and smallpox. On October 10, 1562, then 29 years old, Elizabeth I of England became ill with what the royal attendants believed a cold. Within a few hours, the Queen developed a high fever, and it became evident to the court she had contracted smallpox. A week later, they feared for her life. One attendant to the Queen, her close friend Lady Mary Sidney, contracted the illness from her patient, and though both recovered, Mary was disfigured by the disease. According to Mary's husband, Henry Sidney, his wife retained the scars of which have done and do remain in her face. And she remained in isolation from the world following her recovery, hiding the ravages of the disease from others. Elizabeth recovered without suffering undue scarring, though she did bear some pockmarks as a reminder of the disease. For the rest of her life, Elizabeth masked the pockmarks through the application of makeup which contained lead. The lead withered her skin, accelerated the formation of wrinkles, and thus drove the application of ever-increasing layers of the paste to cover the damage it caused. The smallpox likely accelerated her loss of hair as well, and in her 30s Elizabeth wore wigs in public appearances, to hide her baldness from her courtiers and subjects. Number 12. Wilma Rudolph and polio. In 1945, Wilma Rudolph contracted infantile paralysis, an often crippling disease caused by the polio virus. Prior to her bout with polio, Wilma recovered from both pneumonia and scarlet fever outbreaks. Polio struck her at the age of 5, and though she recovered from the initial symptoms of high fever and partial paralysis, the disease left her with a left leg and foot severely weakened. At 6, Wilma was forced to wear a heavy brace on her leg to stand and walk. For the next several years, Wilma and her mother traveled from their Clarksville, Tennessee, home to Nashville for treatments on her weakened leg. The trips were by bus. At home she received treatments including massage and strengthening exercises several times each day. By the time she was 10, Wilma walked with an orthopedic shoe and continued multiple daily exercises and therapies. By the time she was 12, she walked without the need of orthopedic support shoes. When she entered high school, Wilma ran track and played basketball. In the 1956 Summer Olympics, Wilma was one of 4 women who shared the bronze medal for the 4x100-meter relay. 4 years later, Wilma Rudolph became the first American woman to win 3 gold medals in a single Olympiad, earning the nickname of the Tornado, lauded as the fastest woman on Earth. United Press International named Rudolph the Athlete of the Year in 1960, 15 years after she contracted the disease which paralyzed so many people, before vaccines were developed to contain it. Number 13. Jonas Salk and polio. In the mid-20th century, polio reigned as a frightening disease, often at outbreak proportions around the globe. The number of famous persons who contracted the disease is enormous. Actors Alan Alda and Donald Sutherland both suffered from polio as children. Interestingly, both later portrayed the same character. Hawkeye Pierce in the television program and film MASH. Violin virtuoso Itzhak Perlman suffered polio as a child, leaving him to walk with crutches for most of his life. Golf legend Jack Nicklaus recovered from polio as a child. People feared polio for its terrifying effects, its seemingly random nature concerning when and whom it attacked, and for the lack of a cure or even effective treatment. The 1952 polio outbreaks alone killed 3,145 people and left over 21,000 with some form of disability, the majority of them children. In 1955, virologist Jonas Salk produced an effective vaccine against poliovirus. Following an extensive testing program including over 200,000 volunteers, Salk refused to patent the vaccine, which eventually cost him unknown millions of dollars. He obtained most of his research funding through the March of Dimes, itself created by polio survivor Franklin Roosevelt, and dedicated 2.5 years of his life to develop the vaccine. Salk's vaccine was joined by an oral vaccine developed by Albert Sabin and tested in the late 1950s. Together, the vaccines all but eliminated polio by the end of the 20th century. Number 14. Thomas Nast and yellow fever. Thomas Nast achieved fame as a political cartoonist and caricaturist. Born in Germany, he moved to New York City as a child with his mother and sister while his father served an enlistment on first a French and later an American warship. Throughout his lifetime, outbreaks of yellow fever occurred seasonally in the United States, leading many of the larger cities to be avoided by Americans wealthy enough to do so. Doctors and scientists were unaware of the viral nature of the disease, nor that its primary means of transmission was through the bite of female mosquitoes. Nast spent his career lampooning politicians, exposing corruption, and acting as a propagandist for causes he supported. Contrary to popular belief, he did not create the image of the jackass for the Democratic Party, nor was he the first to draw the iconic Uncle Sam. In 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt, a longtime acquaintance and admirer of the cartoonist, appointed him as consul general to Guayaquil, Ecuador. Nast arrived at his post in July just as an outbreak of yellow fever began. Several diplomatic missions and business entities arranged to leave the area during the outbreak. As was customary at the time, Nast chose to remain at his duties, assisting others fleeing the yellow fever outbreaks. Yellow fever caught up with Nast in the fall. Treatments consisted of attempts to ease the symptoms, which proved ineffective, and Nast died of yellow fever in the first week of December. In 1927, the virus which causes yellow fever became the first human virus to be isolated. Number 15. Alexander Selkirk and yellow fever. Alexander Selkirk served as the basis of Daniel Defoe's fictional Castaway, Robinson Crusoe. Selkirk's career included time as a naval officer, a privateer, and as an outright pirate. In 1704, while on a voyage as a privateer, Selkirk argued with his commanding officer over the seaworthiness of their vessel. The Cinque Ports. When the vessel lay off Juan Fernandez Islands, the argument grew impassioned, and Selkirk rashly announced he would remain on the island alone rather than sail further. The captain took him up on the offer, and Selkirk found himself marooned alone on the island, with meager supplies. Cinque Ports did sink on the ensuing voyage, though the crew survived to be imprisoned by Spanish troops in Lima, Peru. Selkirk was eventually rescued by a privateer expedition in 1709, after 4 years and 4 months of living alone on the island. He did not return to England until 1711, and the following year published an account of his adventures as a privateer and castaway. Gaining a measure of celebrity, 1717 he returned to the sea, probably to escape legal authorities, by joining the Royal Navy. In 1721 he served aboard HMS Weymouth on an anti-piracy cruise off the western coast of Africa. Frequent landings on the coast for firewood and water exposed the men to hordes of mosquitoes, and yellow fever outbreaks ravaged the crew. Selkirk joined the growing list of victims, dying on December 13, 1721, according to the ship's log. Number 16. George Washington and sexually transmitted disease. During the American Revolutionary War, sexually transmitted diseases, primarily syphilis, ran rampant in the Continental Army. The only known treatment widely employed used mercury, itself toxic, and though it worked against presented symptoms, it did not cure the disease. Washington ordered punishment for those diagnosed with sexually transmitted diseases, which led to men afflicted refusing to report their illness, further weakening the ranks of the army. Others sought treatment from nearby civilian communities, which often led to secondary infections and death. During the Revolutionary War, about 25% of men who suffered combat wounds died of secondary infections, and many more died of infections inflicted by medical care providers. Washington imposed fines on those in his army found to be suffering from sexually transmitted diseases. Officers faced fines of $10 and were cashiered for repeat offenses. Enlisted men paid fines of $4, and if non-commissioned officers were reduced in rank to private, Washington established the amounts of the fines in his general orders, and directed the proceeds be used to purchase much-needed medical supplies, including bandages, bedding, and what medicines were available at the time. They did little good. Venereal disease outbreaks remained a problem in the Continental Army throughout its existence, a misfortune which continued in the American Army and Navy through the War of 1812. Number 17. John Augustus Roebling and tetanus. Tetanus is not an infectious disease which can be transferred among people, or from the bites of mosquitoes, but it has been a serious killer since the beginning of time. The Greek physician Hippocrates described the disease in the 5th century BCE. As recently as 2015 there were over 200,000 cases reported worldwide, with well over 50,000 deaths as a result of contracting tetanus. Despite the existence of vaccines against the disease, it develops from bacteria which enter the body through a break in the skin. If left untreated, serious muscle spasms occur, along with fever, high blood pressure, and an accelerated heart rate. John Augustus Roebling's experiments with and manufacturing of wire ropes changed the face of American industry and travel. First used in mines, railroads, and canals, wire ropes allowed for the building of ever longer suspension bridges. While surveying a site for a bridge between the cities of New York and Brooklyn in June 1869, Roebling's foot was crushed by an arriving boat. The injury required the amputation of the toes, but an infection soon set in, and Roebling's overall condition deteriorated rapidly. Less than a month following the accident, Roebling suffered the serious symptoms of tetanus and died on July 22, 1869. Vaccines against tetanus arrived in the 1920s. Number 18. Louis Pasteur and rabies. Louis Pasteur's work saved uncounted millions of lives throughout the world, simply by encouraging healthcare workers to frequently wash their hands and to sanitize them and equipment prior to examining patients. Prior to Pasteur's work with germs and microbes, few doctors bothered to wash their hands between patients. Pasteur developed vaccines for animals and human beings, including vaccine against anthrax, and for rabies. Pasteur created the first rabies vaccine for humans in the 1880s, growing the live virus he used in rabbits. In July 1885, Pasteur successfully used the vaccine on a 9-year-old boy. who had been bitten by a rabid dog days before. Pasteur was not a licensed physician in France, where the vaccination took place over the course of 11 consecutive days. Pasteur administered 13 inoculations to the boy. The boy did not develop rabies despite the fact that he had been bitten by a rabid dog. Pasteur later tested the vaccine on other patients, and in 1886 administered 350 vaccines to people, only one of whom developed rabies. Any of the patients pursued legal action. Pasteur faced prosecution for practicing medicine without a license. None did, and Pasteur basked in the acclaim awarded him as a national hero in France. He left strict instructions to his descendants to never reveal his personal notebooks and diaries. Not until 1964 did his papers appear in the French National Library, with severely restricted access until 1971. Numerous controversies over Pasteur and his methods have emerged since access to the papers loosened in the 1980s. Number 19. Carlos Finlay and yellow fever. History books, particularly American textbooks, give the credit for identifying mosquitoes as culprits in seasonal yellow fever epidemics to Walter Reed, a U.S. Army surgeon. Reed himself gave the credit to Carlos Finlay, who first presented the theory of mosquito-borne spread of the disease in 1881. For the remainder of the decade, Finlay presented a wealth of proofs supporting the theory. Reed arrived in Cuba in 1900, charged with examining several of the tropical diseases which afflicted American troops in the region. Reed used human volunteers for several experiments, which disproved many established beliefs regarding the disease and how it spread. It also established Finlay's hypothesis regarding the spread between humans via mosquitoes as correct. Reed cited Finlay's work in his own papers and in private and professional correspondence, though he became famed as the man who made the discoveries ending the yellow fever outbreaks through mosquito abatement. Reed returned to the United States in 1901 and lectured widely on yellow fever and the discoveries made by the American team he had led in Cuba. In November 1902, he suffered a ruptured appendix, developed peritonitis, and died at the age of 51. The United States Army honored him with several facilities in his name, including the Walter Reed Army Medical Center. In America, Carlos Finlay is all but forgotten. Number 20. Sir Ronald Ross and malaria. Malaria, like yellow fever, was for centuries viewed as a seasonal illness, a product of pestilential air during the warm and humid months. In addition to smallpox, George Washington suffered from malaria in his youth. Not until Carlos Finlay identified the mosquito as the vector, which delivered yellow fever to humans, did scientists and researchers eye the same mode of transmission for malaria. Ronald Ross worked at the Presidency General Hospital in Calcutta, Kolkata, applying Finlay's findings to malaria in India, which occurred at exponential rates annually. Ross proved the life cycle of the malaria virus in mosquitoes, and the transfer of the virus to and from infected birds in 1897. Ross's discovery received further support when Walter Reed's board confirmed the work of Carlos Finlay in 1900. The relationship between mosquitoes and the two greatest of the tropical killing diseases, yellow fever and malaria, offered new means of battling their annual outbreaks: mosquito abatement through pesticides, and the issuance of mosquito-proof clothing and nettings offered protection against the diseases. The first vaccine against yellow fever appeared in 1938. Vaccines against malaria continued to elude researchers into the 21st century. Malaria continued to be treated with quinine, and mosquito abatement efforts continue in areas where malaria is likely to appear in the 21st century.